Hello, everyone, and welcome to Teach Me Teacher, a podcast for educators where we, the teachers, become students ourselves. Here, we learn with laughter, music, and the latest research and experts across the field of education. But more importantly, we learn through honest conversations with real-world teachers and administrators in the classrooms we're experiencing today. I'm your host, Jacob Chastain, and today we're flipping the script a little bit. I feel like this is the season and the year of flipping the script, bringing on different people, some from outside the industry, but connected to the industry of education. And this time we are talking to a parent who is a diehard supporter of schools, teachers, and what schools do for kids. She is talking about getting schools open and creating this dialogue on Twitter. Her name is Jennifer Sey, and she is, I just love everything she says on Twitter. I try not to retweet and like everything she does because I know that's obnoxious, but her message and what she's putting out there is absolutely phenomenal. And I wanted to bring her on the show today to give her point of view as to why she's doing what she's doing on the internet, the arguments that she's using and the arguments that she's seeing, because I know a lot of us don't live in the Twitterverse. I want you guys to be aware that there are places that are not opening. They're actively trying to keep them closed and everything in between. So we're going to let Jennifer explain all of this and more on this episode. But before we get to that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you this episode is sponsored by Hominem, the leading publisher of professional books and resources for educators, and their professional book, Writing Unbound: How Fiction Transforms Student Writers by Thomas Newkirk. Writing Unbound is about the value of writing fiction in secondary classrooms. Thomas Newkirk asks one tough question. If reading fiction is the center of most English classrooms, why is writing fiction often ignored? Why do we separate fiction reading and fiction writing? Tom argues that when our writing curriculum is too analytical, students think of writing as impersonal, formulaic, and boring. He says that opening a door to fiction writing can ignite students' interest and convince them of the value of writing. He even argues that allowing kids to write fiction will improve their analytic writing. Go figure. Go learn more about this at HeinemannPodcast.com. You can find more about that at TeachMeTeacherPodcast.com. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, let's go talk to Jennifer. Alrighty, Jennifer, how are we doing today?
I'm good. Nice to see you.
Yeah, like I said at the top and kind of off air, I am a huge fan, so I love bringing people on that I just kind of follow out in the Twitter world and see your face. But for people that might not follow you or kind of know what you do, what would be a good way of introducing yourself to the show today?
Well, I think the main thing is I'm a mom of 4, and I have a very broad range of ages that I am the mom to. I have a 20-year-old. He currently goes to UC Berkeley in California, so a public university. And I have an 18-year-old, just 18. He's a senior at a public high school in California. And I have 2 very young children who are 6 and 4. My 6-year-old is a kindergartner. And we recently made the trek to Denver because we were frustrated with the fact that the San Francisco schools weren't opening. So we came here so he could go to school. But in addition to being an open schools advocate, which I will say I proudly am and have been for a very long time since last summer, I would, say I've been a sort of long-time advocate for children. I wrote a book in 2008. I was an elite gymnast growing up, and I wrote a memoir about the abusive and cruel coaching culture in gymnastics. And that was not all that well received when it came out. I was pilloried, called a liar, and a greedy opportunist. But ultimately, I think it proved to be the case. It proved to be true. For anyone familiar with the sport who knows about the Larry Nassar case, who's the most sort of prolific pedophile, certainly in American sport, possibly in American history. And then I ultimately also produced the film Athlete A, which is on Netflix, which is about the abusive culture. It came out last year. And so, that was all part of advocating for children to be able to have an environment in sports that was free from abuse. And, to me, advocating for kids to be in school now when so many schools persist in being closed is very consistent with that advocacy for athlete safety, although many people don't see it that way.
Well, and I think that's what I'm really fascinated about. And we talked a little bit about this off air, but I want to bring it to the actual show, which is, when I reached my episode with Brian Mendler, the majority of listeners were very positive about it. They were very supportive of the open schools movement. At the very least, it started some conversations, but there was a hefty amount of people that were vehemently angry at the fact that we were even saying schools should be open. We were considered heartless and granny killers and everything in between, right? I was called a racist in several circles just because of saying schools should be open. And here's the thing, I don't beat the drum all day, and I bring it up every once in a while, especially if I see a bunch of nonsense happening. But this has kind of been your hill and for the last several months, and you even went so far as to move like halfway across the United States to do this. So this isn't like an idle project for you. This is something that's near and dear to your heart, and I want to know why. Like, what is it that's driving you to say what you say and do what you do?
I just can't really imagine what's more important than our children in this country. And I don't know how anyone, the children are the most vulnerable among us. They don't have a voice. They can't vote. If we don't stand up for them, who will? And I think people are really not aware in some instances where schools persist in being closed, that schools have been open since August safely in states across the country, including yours. And sort of the divide is just unbelievable. I just got a note from my son's high school asking, to do a survey to see if he'd like to go to school one day a week before the end of the school year. That would be 2 full days for the whole year. That's 2 more weeks of school before he graduates post-final. So, he's really done. And I believe they're doing this so they can claim they opened high schools. And that to me is a joke. But the reason I do it is I can't really imagine any adult that won't stand up for a child. And, I've been accused of all the things that you cited and more, being a racist, being anti-union, hating teachers, not caring if they die. I've been accused of furthering the narrative that as San Francisco is too cautious, that's where I live and still have a home, that I don't care about vulnerable children. And if they become sick and die, that I'm exaggerating the impact on kids from being out of school for my own selfish benefit, when really I'm thinking about all the kids. My kids are actually fine. I mean, they were really suffering emotionally and mentally in the beginning. My kindergartner's thriving in school. My high schooler seems to have adapted and adjusted. He knows where he's going to college. He's very optimistic about that. I've been accused of being an unfit parent, not caring if my own kids die. It's just relentless. And it's hard, it's harrowing. My feelings are hurt too. But I see what's happening, to my kids' friends and to kids across the country. 3 million kids have fallen off the grid. They haven't logged on in a year. We don't know where they are. Tens of thousands of kids won't graduate. And so, thousands in Los Angeles alone, these disengaged kids who were struggling in school to begin with just are lost to us now. And I don't know how we cannot care about that. I just, as a mom, I don't know how we cannot care about that. And so I'm kind of willing to withstand the opprobrium, which is fairly brutal at times. And it's not just on Twitter. I mean, I get emails, people find me, they tell me directly. There's been some other sort of mishaps to try to sort of dox me, if you will. But I sort of made the choice that I was willing to withstand it because, again, who's going to speak up for these kids, who's going to do it? And I just don't understand a world in which we sacrifice the most vulnerable especially now, right? So for so long now, we've known that schools can be open safely. We've known it. It's been a fact since last summer. Honestly, we've known that kids rarely get sick. They don't pass it at the same rate. Now the adults are vaccinated. Even the juniors and seniors in high school are vaccinated, and yet we persist in keeping these kids out of school. And to me, every day that they're not in school is a crisis. For many of these kids, as we know, they're in abusive environments at home. They don't have enough to eat. I'm not just thinking of my kids. I'm thinking of those kids who have so much less than mine. And some of those kids are my kids' friends, and I see it. And that's not even getting into the sort of mental health challenges now that these kids have been thrown into. And I can see it with my own eyes. I mean, my son has been at home alone on his computer for 7 hours a day for the last year. And it's almost 15 months at this point. Like, how can that be good for a kid? We were all the ones saying less screen time. And now we're just sort of like pushing screens on these kids. So I don't know. I guess I just can't not do it, at whatever sort of personal risk. And, having written the book that I mentioned, that was pretty harrowing as well. And the response to that. So I'm sort of inured to it. Like, I got used to it then. And I knew the more that folks name called me and belittled me and, that I'd hit a nerve, and that it sort of strengthened my resolve in a sense, I guess.
Well, and where this gets me, okay, because I will give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, I know fear was at a height, especially as COVID was coming around. And then when schools closed initially, there was all of the unknowns, but we're at the end of this school year, and there are places that are still asking the question, should we open in August? And I, as someone who's been back since August, right, it's fascinating that these questions are even happening, but it's also fascinating that it's gone past a discussion, and it's no, if you don't agree, if you don't accept our narrative that we're pushing right now for whatever reason, we're going to attack you. We're going to call you all, we're going to throw every slur at you possible. We're going to hurt you in ways that could cause damage to your personal life and everything. And that, to me, when things get like that means it is no longer an intellectual argument. It is now ideology and blind faith in something that really doesn't make sense. And as someone who's been so active, I wanted to get your take on this as to, over the course of the year, how has the narrative changed? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten more extreme? I mean, do you see a shift in anything? Or what has that transition been like since the beginning until now?
I mean, sadly, with more and more evidence, with more and more states opening and districts opening, the criticism, to put it lightly, has not abated, and you're right. California is still suggesting, or certainly not demanding, that all schools be open 5 days a week, full-time in person next year. They're saying perhaps we should still be virtual, which is sort of just astonishing to me. I mean, every teacher will be vaccinated. Like I said, older kids will be probably 12 and up at that point. Under 12, as we know, rarely get sick, rarely spread. And even rarely is sort of an exaggeration in terms of, how likely it is. It's virtually zero statistically. So the conversation has not become less heated. In fact, more. I look around and I look in my hometown of San Francisco. Everything is open as of June 15th. As of right now, adults can stand shoulder to shoulder in a bar, swilling beer, no mask. They can go to strip clubs. They can do all of these things. And my son can't go to English class. I mean, it's sort of astonishing to me. They really are last in line, kids. And I don't know a world where kids shouldn't be first. The effect and the impact on not being in school on the vast majority of kids is so great. And then on top of that, knowing that they don't, and they don't spread and adults are all vaccinated, that want to be at this point, it just kind of blows my mind. And people argue still, well, schools are open. They aren't. Having my son go to high school one day a week is not open for a couple of hours. The fact is only 5% of fourth graders in California have full-time school, public school fourth graders. Private schools have been open since September. And so the inequity in this is just astonishing to me. And I don't know, it blows my mind every day. I don't understand. One of the criticisms I got, you asked what I've been called. One of the criticisms I got was, well, why don't you just send your kids to private? Stop complaining. You have the means. And I do. I could. That's not the point. It's so beside the point. I don't want to. I want my kids to go to public school. I believe in public schools. I get the criticism, well, you've never supported public schools in the past. That's not true. I have two students that went all the way through the San Francisco public school system. I've been an active and engaged parent. I give money. I do whatever I can. I fought to keep my kids' school open in elementary school when it was on the docket to close, because they were closing schools with, they were closing smaller schools for some reason. We kept it open. And so I don't want to send my kids to private. I moved to Denver so my kids could go to public. I want my kids to be around all kinds of families and all kinds of kids, and the vastness that all the kinds of people that go to public school from a class perspective, racial diversity, everything, family diversity. That's what I want. So yeah, it hasn't abated, honestly. To answer your original question, it's still quite heated. I can only think that it's some sort of sunk costs fallacy type thing where, people went in so hard on this that they're kind of defending the original position, and the damage that I think has been done is so great that we can't admit that we were wrong. We have to sort of defend it as still the right thing to do because it saved lives. Because if it didn't, and we did this to a generation of kids, that's too horrific to imagine. And so I find I wouldn't say it's worse, but it's certainly not better. It's equally as heated.
There's a couple things there that made me think of two things. One was at first, I was kind of laughing and just observing. So I love politics. For anyone who's listened to the podcast, I've mentioned it a few times. I keep it mostly out of the show, but I love politics, not in the sense that I'm a diehard one-sider. I genuinely love the debates and the legislation and all of the nuances of what goes on, how things get passed. It's like my sports. I always say the election every 4 years is my Super Bowl. So I'm really interested. And it was, Trump's administration was fascinating during all of this because I was certain, deep down, that people were so anti-schools being open because Trump was so for schools being open, right? I was like, it has to be just a symptom of the Trump hate and that train. And then Biden comes in. They're open schools, and people are still pushing this narrative that schools should be closed despite this. So I was like, wow, this was so entrenched. So that was my first one, because I had people calling me, they were like, you're a closet Trump supporter, stuff like that. I was like, I can promise you I did not vote for, I'm in Texas and whatnot. And, but I promise you I voted for Obama. I voted for Biden and all this other stuff. So, Trump is not my guy, but, still, right. It was just one of those things where it was kind of funny. And then on the other side, so a lot of my, some people that I really genuinely love in the educational industry, we just had this, I would watch them talk about, we would have these conversations on Twitter, for instance, and they would say, school should be open. And they're like, well, and I would talk about how online school was not the same as in-person school. I was like, look, I'm a very qualified educator. I get very good results. I'm very dedicated to my stuff. In no way, shape, or form is my online teaching as effective or as quality as my in-person teaching. And I would use this as my argument, and teachers would go, well, schools were already failing, so what's the difference? And I was like, so it really shed light on even people who make money off of educating teachers just don't believe in this public education system or teachers. And I was like, I didn't know that. Like school saved my life. Teachers were the difference. I wrote a whole book about every teacher that was influential in my life. And to me, it is such a cornerstone of American democracy. I think it is a right for every child. I think teachers are vitally important. And to see so many people, including educators, not think that this was essential, that education could go online and no problems would arise. Like that's what was astounding to me as a teacher watching this. And I was wondering, did you see that political strife happen? Because the Trump, you're a Trump person, and then Trump goes away and it's Biden. Did you see any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the other insults I get is I get called a Trumper, which I don't really think I should have to reveal my politics, but I lived in San Francisco for 30 years. I think you could figure it out. I mean, I've been a lifelong Democrat, and I've said this publicly. And if you look at the other sort of causes and issues that I've stood for and the organizations that I give money to, it's like very clear that I'm not a Trumper. But I would tend to agree with that assessment that the sort of, I didn't like him either. But that response to him saying schools needed to be open, it's like he's wrong all the time, so he can't be right about this. And it was just this sort of knee-jerk response.
I know. I was like, I'm in this world where I'm defending Trump's educational policy.
Yeah, which I never want to do. And, he didn't have a policy. He just said open them. And, some states did. And I'm not actually arguing that that's a bad thing. I mean, the best way to open schools is to open the doors. There was all this hemming and hawing in San Francisco about all the assessments that needed to be done. And, in Europe, they opened the windows. That's what they did. There was a study I just read yesterday showing that the plexiglass that many schools spent, weeks and months implementing actually increased spread in schools. And so all this sort of hemming and hawing about how to get schools ready, which is I think was also because Trump said just open the doors, and the Democrats said we can't just open the doors. I mean, unfortunately, it was very politicized, and it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle is what it feels like. And so even Biden coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to get schools open in the first 100 days, although they were all the percentage that he'd identified, he kind of was there when he got into office because Republican governors in Republican states had just opened them. And he said that, and that was great. But then the guidance from the CDC really kind of stood in the way of that. And in fact, the guidance from the CDC was such that 90% of the schools that were open when they issued the guidance would have had to close. So that's not fighting hard to get schools open. I mean, that's completely absurd. And, the CDC is a nonpartisan organization, I guess, but, their guidance issued did not favor getting schools open. And so, yes, it was highly politicized, and it's unfortunate. And I'm certainly not defending Trump as a leader or as a president. I mean, even a broken clock, I guess, what's the phrase? It's right twice a day. And, he didn't do it or say it for the right reasons. He was saying it so that he could say he got schools open and, win the election, which he didn't do. So it wasn't because he cared so much about kids. I mean, I don't think so.
Right.
That doesn't mean it was wrong. We did need to get schools open. So I think that the crazy thing, you talk about teachers sort of online virtual is not the same. And I do fear we're setting up a world where we're going to go to a permanent virtual option. I mean, is online parenting the same? Like when I'm out of town for work and I have to just talk to my kids on the phone or online, it's not the same. I'm not as good of a parent. Like it's just patently false that it's as good. And we've sort of anointed schools the least essential and the most dangerous places in America by keeping them closed when everything is open and when all other essential workers have gone to work. So I don't know. I think beyond just being absolutely devastated and heartbroken for the damage done in the last year, I'm very fearful for the future about whether or not we're ever going to have full-time school face-to-face again for kids in large cities, which tend to be Democratic, because those are the cities still debating whether or not they should go full-time in the fall. And that makes me nervous. And there's an argument being made that it is better for some kids. Kids that perhaps have learning disabilities or are bullied or are autistic. And I don't know, I have a lot of friends with autistic kids, and most of them have said to me, while their children might prefer to stay home, they don't think it's better for them in the end. They think it's imperative that they learn to interact and that they kind of overcome that. So I don't have that. I don't have a child that, is autistic or has an IEP of any kind. But I think it's important to learn to interact with the world, and so I worry that we won't ever have a full-time option, or that we won't require full-time schooling in California ever. That's what I'm worried about.
Well, as a parent with an autistic son, I know that so it was interesting when we initially shut down, right? When COVID really came and everything locked down, stopped the spread, all that fun stuff. He was the only one that still had his schedule because his ABA therapy center was still open. So I could still take him. So school shut down. And so we just made him full time over there. So he went the majority of the time to do that. And that was like school, ABA, for people who don't know ABA therapies, they work on a variety of skills for them, and it was very beneficial. But just the fact that him having that option and then being back in school in August, I mean, my son is someone who he learns really fast, but he needs scheduling, but he also needs someone that's not his parents. And here's the thing, like the role of education, the role of a teacher, like there's a reason we have created these systems for our kids. And that is because, there's a lot of people are using this moment to really push, homeschooling and to push those things. And I think people should have the right, do whatever you want to do, obviously. But for the vast majority of people, public schools are the best option for social emotional learning, for the academics that they need to set them up on a road to success. The higher they get, the road to college. And there's a lot of pushing, there was an argument being made by several people that I follow who were saying schools are only being pushed to open right now because of standardized test scores, because these companies need money. And I'm like, I don't know. That seems a little conspiratorial to me. It seems very, I don't know how much evidence they have for that specific argument to say.
It's just not true. All you have to do is look at your kid, and I look at my older children who are isolated and, have been lonely and don't have that peer interaction. They're supposed to be individuating from their parents, and they're home with me all day, which can't be good for them. I look at my younger child who's 6, his first experience in kindergarten is staring at a screen and like waving at the screen, and the teacher, he never met his peers. And he even seemed, if you could say a 6-year-old seemed depressed, he seemed depressed. Like he just that's not the way to instill a love of learning. And homeschooling is a different thing. I know several adults, 3 in fact, who were homeschooled. The ones that have kids have all chosen to send their kids to school because they want that socialization experience. I do have a friend who homeschools children now, and that's the right choice for her and her family. But for most families, it's not. And she understands that. And I want my kids to learn from their peers and to interact in that way. And I think what most really great homeschool parents do is they make sure that their kids have that in other ways, right? There's homeschool parent networks. They have activities where, all the homeschoolers interact and sometimes have class together or do other activities. And so I'm not at all criticizing homeschooling. I don't feel equipped to do it. I really don't. I have a full-time job. I don't think it's reasonable or feasible for me. And I just want a different experience for my kid. I liked school. I had the unfortunate experience of going to a lot of different schools, which was difficult to always transition, but I liked it. I liked friends. I liked peer-to-peer interaction. I want that for my kids. And so this notion that it's just about, not falling behind in the test scores, I have opinions about testing. I think it's probably overused. I don't think we should teach to the test. I think you do have to sort of track progress in some way. I don't know enough. I'm not an educator to say how that should be. I leave that to folks like you. But it's just parents seeing what's happening to their kids. I know other parents whose kids are, one hospitalized with an eating disorder, another self-harming, like you just have to look at your kids to know that they're suffering, and some aren't and some are fine, but many are. And this whole notion that it's some sort of conspiracy to feed the testing companies is kind of crazy. Just look at your kid. And then on the flip side of that, I do think there's this sort of, by parents that are fearful and don't want to send their kids back. And that's fine, because all the open schools parents have said continue to provide a virtual option. And even next year, I think if there are still parents that are fearful, I think the district can provide one virtual option. It doesn't need to be on a school by school basis. But if you choose to keep your kid home, here's the virtual school we're providing. So then you don't have that situation where a teacher's having to teach in person and online, which I understand to be very difficult. But there are parents, I think, who are so insistent that their kids are fine. They're just so insistent on maintaining a positive attitude that I don't think they're hearing always or seeing what's going on with their kid. That to me seems, not in every instance, but that's neglectful. Like this sort of, I've heard the phrase toxic positivity, that, that it's all fine and it's just a year and you're resilient and you're going to be fine. And, I think we need to listen to our kids and watch our kids and ask them how they're doing, and sort of not force this narrative on them that they're resilient. Because will they get through it? Many will, some won't. Some won't graduate. Some will never re-engage. Some will fall so far behind that they never reconnect to the learning experience and then not graduate. But we also just have to pay attention to how our kids are really doing. I mean, if I could draw an analogy to my gymnastics career, I seemed fine in the last 4 years. I was very stoic. I was not fine. I was coming apart at the seams. I held it together right until I retired, and then the dam broke, and I literally just fell apart, and I was really depressed and suicidal for on and off for a decade. But everybody was sort of pushing this narrative, my coaches, my parents, that, well, I was winning and I wasn't saying anything was wrong, so I had to be fine. And I just think we need to listen to our kids, and we're not always doing that because we want to believe this isn't harmful.
Hey guys, it's Jacob here from the future. I just want to bring some awesome products to you, and I don't want you to miss it. So here you go, guys. This program is called Rise, and it is for math and ELA. It's a bundled program, and it is less than $30 a year for grades 3 through 8. That's right. It's less than $30 a year. Absolutely amazing. Rise identifies learning groups and creates a unique learning sequence and pace for each child, covering over 1,000 key grade learning objectives in math and ELA. Teachers get real-time feedback and progress. Plus, kids can access Rise offline too through the app. Teachers, check out Rise today for your students. Go to mheonline.com/rise1. That's mheonline.com/rise1. Rise Math and ELA program bundles from McGraw-Hill are less than $30 a year for grades 3 through 8. Go check it out. Absolutely affordable. We all know that we're contending with COVID and everything that's happened this year. So if you are needing something to boost what you're doing, to support what you're doing, or you're just on the lookout for something that's affordable and capable of helping you get kids to where they need to be in your classroom, go check out Rise. That link is going to be at teacherteacherpodcast.com in this post, or you can just go to mheonline.com/rise1. All right, guys, let's get back to the episode. So I'm at a Title I campus, okay? The majority of my students are in single parent households, if that. A lot of them live with grandparents. A lot of them have very difficult situations that they're in. During the summer, when we initially went online, every single one of my kids was saying that they wanted to be back. Every single one of them. When we went back to school, we thought that our campus, because we're actually the in terms of socioeconomic status, ours is we cater to the lowest bracket in our district for our middle schools, and then we have there's other districts that are almost like light years different in terms of the types of students, the family backgrounds that they come from, and we thought that ours would be filled with the kids first. Right? We were like, oh, they're going to come back first. It didn't. The more affluent schools were first, and we were wondering why. And after we did kind of research and talk to kids, it was because there was siblings that couldn't go home. So parents were going to work, but they couldn't. The babysitters were issues. So kids were, I had 6th graders, 7th graders staying at home to babysit, to do all of these things. Tell me, there's people saying like, oh, we need to stop talking about learning loss. Learning loss is not like, there's a learning loss in a variety of ways. Like you said, the drive for just the love of education, the momentum you get from going to different classes, to interacting, to being in that zone. But our kids, I got to tell you, every time we had to quarantine, so we had, I think we've had less than 20 COVID cases on our campus all year, and we've been open since August. But when one kid gets COVID, or a teacher or something, it would quarantine like 30 different people, and they would be home for 2 weeks. And during every time that happened, especially like if it happened to a same student multiple times, which did happen to a few, they were all entirely angry because it messed up their sports. It messed up their academics. It messed up just their socialization. They had to go home to whatever God knows what that they were going home to.
Yeah.
And then you don't hear from them for 2 weeks. It's not like they went home and then got on Zoom and were hanging out. They disappear.
Yeah. And I didn't experience that because ours never opened, but I did hear from a lot of parents how difficult that was, because there's no predictability for the child or for the parents, right? If schools are just shutting down, in New York with the 2-case rule, if there were 2 cases in a school that they couldn't find the connection, they shut the whole school down, even asymptomatic cases, which, most doctors at this point say was completely unnecessary. So I didn't experience that because we were just not in school ever. So I guess it was consistent. That's the benefit of that. And to your point, the more affluent districts, definitely, those kids went back first. I mean, San Francisco is an affluent district, but the public schools are not filled with affluent families. The surrounding districts did open, not full-time, some full-time. So you have the North Bay, sort of Marin County, which is very affluent, South Bay. Those districts, began to open much sooner, but San Francisco persisted. But I have seen studies, I think some families, poor families in particular, who were hit really hard by COVID, and knew people that got very sick and died, were more fearful. But I have seen and read studies that show that which makes sense intuitively, the clearest signal that schools are safe is schools being open. And so what generally happens in a district is, as schools open, there may be a kind of minority percentage, 40%, 45%, that go. But as the school is opened, families do flood back,
That's exactly what happened.
In a fairly short period of time. They quickly get to 70, 80% because they see then that the schools are open. I would argue the same is true for playgrounds. The playgrounds in San Francisco were closed for 8 or 9 months, which, if you live in the city and you don't have a yard, is pretty challenging when you have small children. As you might imagine, they were closed off with caution tape. When you put caution tape around a playground, that says danger. And so even when they opened, people were really afraid to go. They were looking at caution tape surrounding playgrounds for 9 months, even though playgrounds are probably the safest place and the healthiest place for kids to be. Over time, people did come back to the playgrounds, not immediately. People were too nervous. And so it's like this loop, right? Keeping closed schools says they're dangerous. So then people don't want to go back. And it just becomes this like tautology in a sense, that's incredibly frustrating. If you open the schools, they'll come. They will.
Well, and here's the thing. Like you touched on this a little bit, but people arguing about ventilation and everything else. I'm in the oldest school in my district. It's literally breaking down. If a tile, true story. I had a tile come up in my classroom before COVID, and they were like, "Hey, don't touch that. There's probably asbestos on it." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I'm not living in like this fancy like world where like this really great schools, but you know what? We were fine. And I just kept telling people, I'm like, guys, this is not what everything is kind of preaching. And then there's this kind of hypocritical stuff to where people, they would say schools should be closed, and then they would, be caught taking their kid to private school or something like that. And I think over and over again, as we've gone through this issue, and as more places have opened, but some places are still staying closed, and they're beating this drum louder. I just can't help but say, like, for people who, like, maybe there's someone listening that is in a place that's closed, and I don't know, like, what do you think's been lost during all of this? Like, what have we lost by by closing these schools for so long, and some places still being closed and not even 100% certain that we're going to open in August? What are we losing by having this hesitancy for these kids?
What we've lost, and I want to come back to your point about your school being old in a second, which is sort of a smaller point than the one I'll make. Well, in addition to the 15 plus months of lost learning, I won't even call it learning loss, but we've had 15 plus months in places like San Francisco.
That's a great turn of that phrase. Lost
learning. But I think the bigger loss, frankly, is the deprioritization of children in our culture. And my dad's a pediatrician. He says to me, what are you talking about? They were never prioritized. And I think there is some truth to that, but that doesn't mean it's okay to make it worse. So I think we've really sort of sacrificed that. And we've established that schools are simply not essential and that public schools are not essential. And I don't know what that does to this generation. I mean, it's not good, right? That has firmly been established, especially in large cities across America, that public school is simply not essential. And that just is heartbreaking, because what choice do these kids have? The other thing I've been accused of is being a pro sort of charter advocate or school choice advocate. I used to kind of think, not for me. I mean, to say I was anti-charter would be sort of too strong, but I certainly had chosen regular public. But now, I mean, if I'm a tool of the charters, never having sent my kids to one, which is what I've been accused of being, okay, if charters open and they're free, for a lot of parents, that's a good option. You just can't not give parents any option. I mean, the number of women who are now out of the workforce because they've had to be home and take care of their kids and try to help them with this online learning. And schools are not babysitters. That's the other thing we've all been accused of, is sort of thinking of teachers as babysitters. I love teachers. I love public school teachers. That's why I've chosen to send my kids to public school. You're the ones calling yourselves babysitters. We don't think you are. I think you're a much better teacher than I am. That's why I don't want to do it. I want you to do it. And I'm good at helping at home. I'm good at supplementing and helping with homework, but I would not be good at it all day. And so anyway, I think that is the biggest loss. And I find it really heartbreaking that we've established schools as inessential. And as you pointed out, it's a civil right. A free and equal education is a civil right in this country, and we've just determined that that's not necessarily important. As far as the ventilation, one of the funniest things someone said to me during this whole process, and I realize this is a smaller point, because, European schools have really prioritized getting kids back, and they've been back since the fall, and they've shut periodically, but not for long periods. They've really sort of adhered to that first to open, last to close mindset. And they've opened windows, and, kids under 10 are not even masked there, which is sort of a separate point. I don't want to get into that. That's too controversial. But I made the point that, their advanced ventilation systems were just opening windows. And I was told, but the schools here are so old. The buildings here are old. And I said, older than Europe? I mean, are you kidding me? Like, every building there is older than all of America. Like, it's just insane to say that. And I'm not saying the schools shouldn't have proper ventilation. They absolutely should. I just think we've made it more complicated than it needs to be in an effort to persist in keeping them closed. And I do really think it ties back to this whole sunk cost thing, right? We fought so hard to keep, not me, but collectively in many cities across America. There was a fight by leaders, teachers unions, some parents to keep the schools closed. And the idea that could have been just such a catastrophic mistake is too great to contemplate. And so we have to kind of double down on it. And it's very sad to me.
The hallmark of a bad argument is the movement of the goalpost, right? And I feel like that is what defines the school closure movement, if you want to call it that, is, it started as one thing, and then they set one goal, and then when that goal was met, they moved it, and they keep just kind of moving it. And it's never enough, right? Nothing is ever enough. They want to keep grabbing for this or that. And I realize what happens is, and I don't know why public school teachers didn't get this at first. So we lost several teaching positions this year. When I say teaching positions, that means that the district decided you don't need this many teachers anymore because your student body's lower. You know why our student body's lower? Two reasons. One, kids went elsewhere when schools closed initially. Two, we had failure rates that were very large because of online. And when kids fail, they go to different districts because they don't want to repeat or go to summer school. Because what happens when you have kids that if they can barely afford rent, they're not going to pay to send their kids to summer school. So we have all of these. But guess what happens because of all of this? Kids leave, teachers lose their jobs, right?
That's right.
You lose teaching. And this whole time, I'm like, guys, if you don't open, someone else will. You will not have a job. Like, that was my whole thing. Like, ignore all of the other arguments. I'm like, how are you not even concerned about your own well-being and career at this point?
Well, it's a great point. I would argue the other hallmark of a bad argument is bad ad hominem attacks, which you addressed earlier. Just sort of ending the argument by saying, well, you're a Trumper or you're a this or you're a that, because it's not really like a debatable point. It just sort of ends all conversation. But I would agree with you. I mean, I know in San Francisco and in California more broadly, enrollment in public schools is way down. People with means and even without, people are scraping every penny together to try to send their kids to parochial or to private. They've all been open. People are going to charters, public charters, which are quite good in San Francisco, though my children never attended them, or they're leaving the city, like I did. And people are scraping together, like I said, everything they have to be able to do it because they can't really function as a family with their kids not in school, in a 2-income household where you're perhaps barely getting by, which is not me. I don't want to represent myself. I'm the working parent. I do very well. So I've also been accused of misrepresenting myself. I don't want to. I'm not misrepresenting myself. I could put my kids in private. I don't want to. I believe in public schooling, which is why we're here. But yeah, the enrollments are way down. I think they expected in kindergarten in San Francisco that they might pop up this year because some parents chose to, redshirt their kids because they felt like, well, this is a lost year, so I'll just wait and put them in later. But they're down, I think, over 10%, which doesn't bode well. And so you're right. As parents leave to seek other options, whether charter, public, private, or another state altogether, there will be fewer teachers employed in the San Francisco school district. It's inevitable, right?
Well, and what's so funny because I follow, I like I said, I'm a political junkie, so I follow journalists on the left and right. And the biggest proponent of school choice has been school closures. Well, that's the thing. Yeah. That's what was so funny to me, that I was being accused of sort of like, a tool of the charter movement. I'm like, we're doing the public schools are doing this to themselves. Like I've never supported charters in my life. My son does go to one now, a public charter here, because he goes to a Spanish immersion public school. He was in one in California, and he went to a Spanish language preschool. And it was important to us that he just sort of learned to be bilingual. My husband speaks 3 languages, and we thought from a young age, that's how you kind of do it. I don't. But he's fluent in Spanish, and we tried for the regular public here, and they had no room, and this one did. But yeah, the best argument is being made by the public school system. I don't have to do it. I don't have to do anything. You're making this argument yourself. So the whole thing, I do find it kind of confounding and complicated and sad. And even though my kids are in school now, I will continue to kind of speak up on this one because too many kids still aren't. Most kids in San Francisco still do not have access to a full-time education, if any education at all, even hybrid. So, folks have said, well, you can stop now because your son's, in kindergarten. Well, my high school has not had a single day of school. And like I said, since March 13th. And what about the 53,000 other public school students in San Francisco? As I said from the beginning, this wasn't just about my kids. This was about all kids. If it was just about my kids, I would have pulled them out and put them in private.
right? Like that's never been what this is about for me. And, the same was true in sports. It was never just about me. By the time I found my voice and kind of spoke up, I was fine. I was an adult. I was almost 40 years old. This was about all the kids coming up in the sport. So the accusation of selfishness is really sort of mind-boggling to me. But anyway, we'll keep pushing. I find it really sad that California is even debating, whether or not to have full-time school next year. They have the lowest case rates in the country. They have the highest vaccination rates in the country. Open the doors, please. That's all I would say. And good for you for teaching this whole time and kind of getting this message out there.
Hey, I love what I do, and I love teaching, and I love students, and I love talking to passionate people about this stuff because it's crazy that we're at a place where we're defending public schools and now it's just every step of the way. It's like, guys, we do this for a reason. Like, if you don't care about this, if you're not passionate about this subject, then I don't even know how you're functioning these days, because this is one of the great issues of our time. I think that we're going to look back on and realize that we made the wrong decision. I
agree with you. I mean, the fact that it's a controversial statement to say all kids deserve an education is so completely mind-boggling to me. And I think 10 years from now, the fact that was controversial is going to be like, what were we thinking? And I think the long-term repercussions of what has happened in the last 15 months, because it's not just a pause, it's some kids literally are lost forever in the system. They truly are. You're a teacher, this, thousands, tens of thousands across the country, as I said, will not graduate. That means they're going to have difficulty getting employment. It shortens their lifespan. It's a devastating impact. And I think right behind them are other kids that perhaps struggled for many years that will not ever reengage and will not graduate. So this is a generational problem, and I think we're going to feel it for many, many years to come. And unfortunately, those children with the least resources are the most impacted. The ones that education is a total lifeline, that the public school system and one great teacher is a total lifeline to build a future for themselves. And we just pulled it away. It just makes me want to cry. I mean, I cry about it every day.
Jennifer, if people wanted to find you, follow you, support you in any way possible, how do they do that? How do they stay in contact?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so that's the best way. My DMs are always open, which is how you found me. So Jennifer Sey, my last name is Sey, is probably the best way.
And that is it for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Jennifer Sey, you guys, and one of the rare occasions where the entire episode is released at once. We like to do 2 parts, but I learned my lesson last time when we had Brian on the show. The 2 parts just weren't good enough, because when we're dealing with detailed responses, when we're dealing with a lot of arguments, so to speak, it really does help just to have the full conversation out there, not have to wait for part 2. So shout out to Jennifer for coming on, leading the good fight. And guys, I want to be 100% transparent about kind of this episode and various other things going on, which is I reached out to so many people, big and small, to come on to Teach Me Teacher and advocate for school closures and to give that side of the argument. Guess how many people took me up on it? None. That's why there haven't been an episode. I'm sure, putting this out there on the podcast, someone will come out and say something, but none. Every single one of them. And I tried multiple times with multiple people, and they all had various reasons. Of course, I'm not going to call anyone out because that's ridiculous, but I just want to say that the other side refuses to come on to one of the top teacher podcasts in this space and put out the argument. And, I think there's a variety of reasons for that. But ultimately, Teach Me Teacher is here to give you guys information, let you decide on where you want to be. I bring on interesting people that I think make quality arguments about various aspects, whether it be curriculum, pedagogy, testing, or something as politically charged as school closures and opening during our times at COVID. And, just we're close to the end of this season, and we started this season talking about COVID and not being sure what was going to happen. And now that the year is almost over and there are places that are still asking the question, there's educators still asking the questions about whether schools should be open in August, I felt like it was time to bring this back up and reignite the conversation, start the conversation, whatever. So let me know what you thought of Jennifer. Let her know what you thought. Let's keep it cordial, ladies and gentlemen. I think the Teach Me Teacher audience is incredibly positive almost all the time, but the amount of negativity that people came out of the woodworks for the last time we said this, which was several months ago. So I'm interested to see how you guys respond to this one. So let me know. This is probably going to be another episode I drop over there on YouTube. The Eric Weinstein episode has just been blowing up in the YouTube space. I guess I'm just going to have to start releasing the audio over there on YouTube these days. But I'm going to drop this one, see what you guys think. So if you're listening to this on YouTube, if you're one of the several hundred that have subscribed to the Teach Me Teacher YouTube channel just from that Weinstein episode, shout out. But let me know what you think about this. If there's a space for the podcast on YouTube, then I will be more than happy to release it over there. So we'll see how this one does. Eric is a very large name, so that's probably contributing to the majority of the listens over there. But if we're getting new people, and passionate educators who care about addressing issues and kind of breaking echo chambers and having detailed conversations about stuff, then I think that would be great just to welcome in another section of people that listen to podcasts on YouTube. So shout out to you if that's you. If you want to support this show, ladies and gentlemen, go and rate it over there on your podcast app of choice. Give this a thumbs up if you're listening on YouTube. Subscribe to the show. We release a podcast every single Monday without fail, even when we're out of season. For those of you who don't know, I kind of do seasons for myself just to kind of keep track of the years of doing this show. And I like changing up the podcast every season. I like change. I like doing different things. I'm a creative creator and I have fun. I couldn't just do this podcast over and over again without changing things. So that's all the closing of a season means. We usually do something fun for the summer. Last summer, we did the summer blast of inspiration with a bunch of Instagram teachers because everyone was all sad about COVID and everything else. So I don't know what we're going to do with this summer, but guaranteed that it's going to be fantastic. Come back next Monday, you guys. We have a fantastic episode. I actually brought on someone, again from Twitter, but someone that I actually disagree with on a variety of topics, but he's so respectful and wonderful that I just had to respond to him, and it is a fantastic episode. I actually loved diving into the weeds on some of the things that he challenges that we brought up on the podcast before. So stick around for that, you guys. Thank you for listening. Check out my book, Teach Me Teacher, on Amazon if you want to support my work. Leave a review. Share this podcast with someone that you think needs to hear it. Share it on Twitter. Let's get this conversation going. If you need to DM me, my DMs are always open, ladies and gentlemen. But for everything else, have a good one.